This is TWiT.
I think we should talk about Redbreast. We were, my brother-in-law, Uncle Joe, is a Irish whiskey guy. And I actually kind of thought Irish whiskey wasn't good until he gave me some. I said, this is good. I love Middleton. And so we wanted to give him a gift on his birthday a few months ago. Lisa went to the Bevmo, as one does, and they said, you should take a look at this Redbreast.
Yep.
And it was great.
Yeah. And I'm going to tell you how it was different from other age recognized whiskeys. But we need to go back because the Irish will be the first to tell you they invented this stuff.
That's true.
Now,
That's true.
remembering that all of these cereal products are actually products from the Mideast, going back to the Assyrian Empire and the Fertile Crescent and all that good stuff. So actually the strongest evidence seems to be somewhere in the 10th to 12th century. Monks traveling back from the Mediterranean brought not really early, but alembic stills, the simplest kind of still made of copper that was good for distilling alcohol from grain in very small scales. And so that kind of kicked off the business that exists in Ireland first. But there's lots of hooks and twists around that. So the first licensed distillery in the Western world, 1608, in the northern part of Ireland, in the district called Bushmills. And that location still has a distillery on it. It's obviously burned down a couple of times along the way. It's called the Old Bushmills Distillery. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean they were making whiskey then. Whiskey was made the whole time. I mean, the bottom line was people who had excess grain and needed to do something with it would use these little stills to make an alcohol from that. It was a good way to store those remains and have some results. But the original sort of moonshine of Ireland is called poitín, Poitin, poitín. And it is jet fuel, right? It's a clear alcohol before you've done any aging in barrels and so forth. So inexpensive to make, simple, and it's so stunningly common, and arguably still is to some degree, that it's like everybody had a grandma who made poitín. Now, and so in 1608, when they did the original licensing, this was the idea that now it was going to be a taxable product. And so they had this idea of Parliament versus poitín whiskey. And so naturally, once you're going to play taxation games, you get rules in place. And so by 1661, poitín is outlawed. No personal alcohol anymore. I come to appreciate, as I've been assembling this history, to realize that as the Industrial Revolution started applying to alcohol and it became a bigger business, all of the experiments in taxation, they happened here. Everything that you can do wrong with taxing, this whole, taxation without representation and so forth. Yeah, this all happened here. So, fast forward 100 or so something years, in the late 1700s, there are literally thousands of distilleries in Ireland. They've declared them all, but everybody's making whiskey their own way. They're all different. There's no standards of any kind. And so new rules are brought in place. Now, to be clear, this is the English trying to control the Irish, right? And a part of this entire dynamic is the conflict between the English and the Irish. And so while there may have been 1,200, 1,300 distilleries in 1779, by as soon as these regulations started to be put in place, the distilleries start vanishing. They don't actually vanish. They just stop talking about them. The poitín is still well underway. And in 1785, in order to come up with a new way to tax whiskey, the English instituted a tax on malted barley. And so now you have the rules where you have to malt a particular way. It takes a certain amount of space, so it's always obvious. And based on the weight of the malted barley you pay a tax on top of that. And the Irish response to that, it was to use less malted barley. In fact, one of the distinctive aspects of Irish whiskey to this day is that they use both a combination of both malted barley and unmalted barley. So they didn't germinate it. And that really comes from this taxation behavior 150 years ago. 250 years ago. So, and funny, oddly enough, that law, when written, said, oh, by the way, don't use unmalted barley. Yeah, they didn't worry about that part, not at all. So by the early 1800s, 1821 or so, we're down to less than 30 distilleries left in Ireland. The industry is largely being strangled. It's gone completely underground. And so the taxation rules are sort of lifted to allow things to expand. And that takes us to the most seminal event, I would argue, in whiskey making as a whole. And we've talked about this previously in the Scottish sections, when Aeneas Coffey developed the coffee still. So he was actually a whiskey taxman. So he was able to observe a lot of distilleries as he was collecting duties and taxes in lots of different places. And so there were already versions of column stills at the time, but he came up with a column still that was very, very heat efficient. And it's amazing to me to think in terms of, this is 1830. So like James Watt's original steam engine is only a few decades old at this point. Like the industrialization of alcohol making is still pretty new. And I mean, we talked about it a little bit when we were doing the Scottish section about how important the coffee still was. But the big thing was not only that it was continuous production, that you're always feeding wort into the top and alcohol's coming out of the other side, but that it used steam for heating. The alcohol explosions largely came from the fact that you were putting fire underneath of a pot of mash that was being turned into alcohol vapors, and then sometimes they catch fire and big bad things
possibly
happen.
Go wrong.
And so one of the key aspects of Aeneas's coffee still was that the boiler's in a different building, and you're piping the steam into this double column still assembly to safely heat it at a controlled rate and to be able to extract the alcohol efficiently and continuously. So here's the kicker. Aeneas comes up with this unbelievably efficient, continuously running still that maintains thermodynamics effectively, makes a better, higher distillate alcohol with less effort. The Irish won't use it. It goes totally against the style of the way they're making whiskey. They do pot distillation, where you have a large copper pot, sort of pear shaped, that you load the mash in the wort into, and then heat slowly and it refluxes on the walls of the copper still until eventually out the lye arm into the condenser. You know who does use it? The Scottish. The Scottish build tons of them under license. And they start distilling with the thing that the coffee still does brilliantly is it distills grain rather than malt. So they start cutting their whiskey 50, 60% grain alcohol, which drops the price by 75%. This is the original blended whiskeys. And so they dominate the market. It's the least expensive whiskey. It still tastes good. It's made incredibly efficiently. It takes less time to produce. And so the Irish market is now being crushed to the point where the Irish decide, we need to fix this with branding. And up until this point, whiskey was spelt without an E. In fact, the branding exercise in Ireland that fought back against this was adding the E.
They added an Internet Explorer E. That was their solution.
Yeah, that was it.
They added the E, and that was the key. You know, they're like, we're not going to fix our process. We're not going to come up with a more efficient way to make whiskey. We're going to add an E.
That's really funny. I was wondering about that spelling difference. That's hysterical.
So that's the spelling difference comes out of this. The Scots starting to dominate the market, which they will do again. But because the Irish are doing well, they are selling into the UK. They also selling extensively in America until the World War One. The reels really come off in World War One. It's not just the war itself, which is the original industrialized war. Like we've been talking about this growth and industrialization of whiskey making, but then you have the industrialization of war, followed immediately after the war by the Irish War of Independence, where they fight back and get their independence from England, which they succeed in doing. It takes a few years, but also closes that market for them in the process, so they can't sell Irish whiskey into the UK anymore. Followed by U.S. prohibition, 12 years of no selling alcohol in the U.S. So once again, the Scottish market gets completely devastated. The Scottish market grows because the Scots happily learned how to smuggle in a big old hurley. And they build out, and we talked about this in the Scottish section, where there were groups of folks that actually started buying ships and dropping alcohol off in Canada and getting across the borders in various ways. And so at the grimmest period of the Irish whiskey manufacturing period is by the 1960s. So post-war post-World War II recovery, and there are really only two functional distilleries left anywhere in Ireland. There's the old Middleton distillery, which is actually the Jameson distillery outside of Cork.
Yep.
And there's the Bushes distillery up in the north.
So have you been to both those?
I have.
Yeah, I've been to the Jameson one.
Yeah. And so there's actually three entities. Jameson makes a deal with the Cork distillers and John Powers, and they form one entity. It's like to stay alive. They call it the Irish Distillers Group. And pooling their money, they decide to build one new distillery. This is how they're gonna make all the whiskeys in the same place, operating more efficiently, and that is what we now know as the New Middleton Distillery, which opened in 1975. And at the time was one of the largest distilleries ever built in the world. Where typical pot stills at the commercial grade in Scotland were 5,000 to 6,000 liters, and today your sort of lightweight, small, custom boutique maker will be about 1,500 liters. These were 75,000 liter pot stills. These pot stills they spanned across multiple floors in a building. They were absolutely titanic. But they were also now a monopoly, right? There was one group running the distillery. They made a bunch of different products. They were now buying up the bankrupted brands of the other. So there was plenty of remains of distilleries around. In fact, there still are to this day, but they would scoop up the various brands. And this is where you get all of these different names like Redbreast and Green Spot and they all got consolidated under this Irish Distillers, which ultimately was bought by the French group Pernod, the same guys who owned Chivas Regal. But coming into the 80s, whiskey becomes hipper. And I would actually lay this at the feet of the Americans more than anything. You know, when we talk about the wave upward of whiskey, the distinctive thing that makes whiskey is that you take a clear distillate alcohol and you age it in wood. But wood is expensive and hard to come by until the Americans start making a lot of bourbon, and they institute an important rule, which is you only get to use the barrel once. And so America, with its huge amounts of oak forests, is now making tons of barrels, using them once, and they need a market for them. And the Scots buy them, and so do the Irish. And so all whiskey industry ascends because of this explosion in availability of barrels. And so by the 1980s, we start to see new distilleries opened up, like the Cooley Distillery, which is up in the Northeast and makes a number of well-known products. And then in 1997, they actually officially legalized poitín. It's essentially what we know in America as White Dog, just unbarreled grain whiskey. And so by 2013, literally now we're in the modern times already, we're up to 5 registered distilleries now. There's the Kilbeggan Distillery, which I had an opportunity to tour. The original was opened in 1757 and shut down in 1957, and then now is reopened in 2007. We're starting to get their lines up again. The New Middleton Distillery, which is still there, but has been expanded. These are the guys who make Jameson, Tullamore, Redbreast, all of the spots. That's the green, the yellow, the blue, and the red. Out in the West Coast, Dingle had a distillery. Cooley, which is in the Northeast, that's Connemara, and they reopened the old Bushmills Distillery in the north of Belfast, literally in the Bushmills County. The declaration of the standards of Irish whiskey only came in 2016. So they've only really modernized their approaches to things by saying, okay, it has to be matured and distilled in Ireland, whether that doesn't matter whether it's Republic or North Ireland, same diff. That you have to have some kind of malt, although there's a bunch of ways to do that. They talk about saccharification, fermented by yeast, distilled to no higher than 94.8%, which is bloody high. Only water and perhaps caramel color added to it. At least 3 years in wooden casks. Finished ABV of 40% or above, and with a few different varieties defined. So what makes Irish whiskey distinct? Now, in the earlier days of Irish whiskey, they would use whatever grain they could land their hand on. I have seen mash bills that had like oats in it. But today, the defining aspect of Irish whiskey is, or what they typically call pot still whiskey. is a combination of malted barley and unmalted barley. That is that is distilled in a pot still with reflux, and then is aged in wooden barrels for at least 3 years. Although typically won't have an age statement on it. Although the same rules, the age statement has to be that much. But it's also distilled 3 times. So where the Scots are malted barley only, twice distilled, the Irish are malt and unmalt, triple distilled, but otherwise aged in barrels. Well, by the way, in the regulations for 2016, they say the E is traditional, but not required. So, yeah, typical of these kinds of whiskeys is the Redbreast. I think Redbreast 12 represents, it looks like a Scottish whiskey, but the distinction is it's 50-50 of malted and unmalted barley. I mean, why does this make a difference? Malted barley means you've germinated it, right? You've essentially used the plant itself to begin to break down the sugars. And the way that barley does that is with an enzyme called amylase. So when you add water and a bit of time and temperature, the amylase comes out of the seed and begins to break the carbohydrates into simpler sugars, which makes it easier to extract. Unmalted barley, it's still combined that way, but there's other ways for us to induce sugar release. You can do it with heat and pressure. So you can cook the grain a bit, and that will help break the sugar down. You can also introduce other enzymes that help break those sugars down. The difference is in the flavor. You get a different kind of grain flavor from unmalted barley than you get from malted barley. Either way, you're lifting a lot of that flavor out because you do tend to distill it quite a bit higher than the Scottish distillery processes do. And then you're aging it typically for less time. It is unusual to have age statements on Irish whiskeys. Most Irish whiskeys you see don't have it. Redbreast being one of the exceptions. That 12 is the youngest thing in their bottle when they actually bottle it. You can find this in America today fairly easily. It is about $55, and it is aged in a combination of bourbon and Oloroso sherry casks. So very much a Speyside style whiskey, just made with the Scottish pattern of a mixture of malt and unmalt and triple distillation.
And it's quite good.
Delicious.
I might add.
This is possibly only the second one you've recommended I can buy in the state of Pennsylvania.
Yeah.
Oh, there you go.
That might be true. Yeah, they have this in Bevmo. I know that.
Yeah, no. And I try to make sure I'm finding a whiskey that people have a chance to buy. I think it's I can always pick you a whiskey you can't find.
Right.
Years ago, Carl and I were doing a .NET Rocks tour across Ireland, as you do. And we were in Dublin. And we were meeting a friend of his, a musician friend of his, and he had brought some Angel's Envy, some American bourbon with him to give to his friend as a gift. Nice thing to do. And we arrived early, as we are prone to do when it involves a bar, and found ourselves some Redbreast 12. So we were very happy sipping away at that. And his friend arrived, and we gave him the gift, and we had a nice chat. And he's sipping his Guinness and watching us out of the corner of his eye. He was very concerned, actually. And finally, after an hour or two of us steadily drinking Redbreast, he says, "Well, God bless you, boys." Walk? Yeah. Bless you, boys. I don't know how you drink the brown liquor like that. And it's like, I'm not sure what you mean. He says, "Oh, no, I can't drink the brown liquor. Makes me fight."
I love it.
And I'm like, "Well, give us back the Angel's Envy." So, "I will not." Right? I'll take it home.
Yep. That's
very
great.
Nice. Yep. Redbreast. It says right on the label, single.
I feel like Irish whiskey is. What that means. I feel like you can almost always tell when a whiskey is an Irish whiskey. Is that?
Oh yeah.
Well, especially if it's a pot still whiskey, because they'll have that grain flavor to it, which is fairly distinct.
Yeah, it has a distinct.
There is a declared version of Irish whiskey called a single malt, which is straight malted barley, and then there are you'll see single grain, which means they're not using any malt, or they're using a minimal amount of malt. The days of complex mash bills seem to have gone by. I remember reading about these years ago where they were doing grain and wheat and rye and oats and so forth, but mostly that's been eliminated by just barley processing is simpler. There's lots of challenges when you start to mix mash bills that complexly, and corn's not that cheap in Ireland, so it's not a great grain to choose the way it is in America, where corn is very, very cheap.
Ladies and gentlemen, you have received wisdom from the man, the myth, the Scotch drinking legend,